Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a Monday. It is the second day of February, and it is the day following the Super Bowl. And it's snowing, and it's getting colder and colder here in Appalachia. I welcome you to today's program. I want to thank you for giving us a portion of your Monday. I do invite you to participate actively in our program rather than just listening by calling in and sharing your ideas and your thoughts on some of the issues that we'll be dealing with. Our phone number, which is reserved for you to do just that, which is to call in and be heard by our other listeners. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N. If you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, I would love to hear from you. We can carry on our conversation, if you will, one-on-one via email. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906, all one word, at gmail.com. I kind of made up my mind this morning that I wasn't going to take any time here talking about the Super Bowl because everybody else is. Obviously I'm so elated, but again, you know, I didn't anticipate that New England would win the game. I was just hoping that it would be a good game and that New England and Tom Brady would acquit themselves admirably so that they wouldn't get blown away. And of course, as you did, I think the whole nation did. The audience they had was in excess of 49% points. 49% of the listening audience was tuned in. It's incredible response to the game, the most watched game ever, and it was a game. And again, I did have the luxury of liking both teams. I have very, very fond feelings for Seattle, not only because I had visited there several times, but Russell Wilson is a Wisconsin guy, although he was only there 1 year. And of course, Pete Carroll. I loved Pete Carroll when he was coaching New England. So I wouldn't have been that upset. I would have been upset, but not that upset. But anyway, it is a pleasure to be with you on this Monday following one heck of a game. I do invite you to call in, and I wanted to begin our program today by first of all thanking Bob Kincaid and the folks at Head On. Those of you who are regular listeners to Bob's program in the evening on the Horn, on the Head On Radio Network, are probably aware that based on our conversation, our discussion about a proposed piece of legislation here in West Virginia legislature on the last time we were together here at the Virtual Center, which was last Wednesday, Bob had suggested that it might be, since he was going to deal with it on his program on Thursday evening, he suggested it might be a good idea if I called in. So I did. I called in just shortly after 6 p.m. when the program began, and very honestly, I was on for the full 3 hours. It was an incredible experience. We had some absolutely unbelievable calls, and I'm kind of guessing that this is not news for many of you listening here to the Virtual Center, because I'm guessing as well that a number of you, probably most of you, are regular listeners to Bob Kincaid's program in the evening. So you probably heard this as well. I going in, I had never dreamed that I would be on the air for more than a half an hour, 45 minutes at the most, as Bob and I discussed this issue. But once the calls started to come in from callers around the nation, around the world, actually, I began to realize how significant this particular issue is, and how very, very interested the listeners to the Horn are in this particular issue. Consequently, on Saturday afternoon, I decided that I would try to put together on paper my particular reactions to this piece of legislation. And over the course of 2 or 3 hours, I was able to put together what I am fairly comfortable with is a fairly substantive piece, I think, on the legislation and on what's wrong with the legislation. And I thought that if you folks here at the Virtual Center didn't mind, I would open today's program by beginning by sharing my thoughts on this particular issue with you. Again, I do solicit your input, your calls at 304-663-4676. I would thoroughly enjoy your response. And again, I don't, I was going to begin by kind of going back and retouching the bases that we touched upon on last Wednesday, which I usually do because it's been 5 days since last we were together. And I thought that today that I might be able to do that by just sharing with you the piece that I put together and maybe making a comment or two about it and inviting your input. And if you are inclined to call in, I invite you to do it. But let me begin by giving you my thoughts on paper about the particular piece of legislation we were talking about last Wednesday, the same legislation that we were talking about for close to 3 hours on Bob's program on Thursday evening. I entitled this piece, and you could title it a number of different things, but the one that seemed to me to be most significant was this one. Can we try to give our kids a fighting chance, please? The totally select, but like this, about related to the particular piece of legislation. What it says about attitudes toward our young people. Obviously, we're talking about legislation specific to West Virginia, but more than one person in the call-in last Thursday night made the point that there was a guess. One of the callers was guessing that this was probably more than anything else in the context of a trial balloon, that if it worked or excess or there was too much bash to, then it would perhaps be tried in other states. So I think one of the things that I got out of our discussion on Thursday night was the fact that this clearly is not an issue that is totally focused only on the state of West Virginia. Based on the amount of out-of-state money that is pouring into this state and pouring into a number of other states, many of you probably have seen the reports in the media that the Koch brothers and other wealthy donors to our camp have to pull together and invest or to spend $889 million in the 2016 presidential elections in support of Republican candidates. So $889 million is more money than Republican or Democratic Party allocate for election purposes. So I think what we're talking about is very significant amounts of dollars coming from a number of places around the country And so therefore, what happens in one state clearly is not news to other states. And if you presume even minimum that the made kind of legislation was probably as much as anything else a trial balloon, might be well taken. This indeed could be it. So anyway, can we try to give our kids a fighting chance, please? And I think you'll get the point of that title as we go on. I opened with reference to a piece of legislation, a policy that was brought before our West Virginia State Board of Education a couple of weeks ago, dealing with national standards related to the teaching of science. And there was an effort by a couple of board members here in the West Virginia State Board to alter the language of the national standards in order to accommodate the bizarre thinking of those people who continue to insist that concern about climate change is a hoax. And so basically, what these two individuals were able to do successfully, because the rest of the board went along with it, is to change the standards in West Virginia so that not only would the standards make reference to the fact that climate temperatures throughout the world seem to be increasing, what they added was continuation rate up and down. And of course, the clear implication there is that this is some sort of a natural phenomenon, and therefore that human impact on the climate, on the environment, is secondary, which flies in the face of almost all of the scientific community. So I made reference with that because that just occurred within the last couple of weeks here in West Virginia, and there was such an outcry from throughout the state that the board backed off and went back to the original standards. And so I made reference to that as at the beginning of this piece. So let me begin. The dust is only now beginning to settle after the bizarre, downright humiliating antics of two cretin-like elitists on the West Virginia Board of Education to alter the next generation science standards in defense of ignorance, closed-mindedness, and the right to believe whatever makes people most comfortable, even if it's wrong. Shame on them. But wait. On January 20th of this year, 11 members of the new Republican majority in our state legislature sponsored House Bill 2107, a bill ostensibly aimed at strengthening appreciation for the nation's founders and understanding of the nation's most important historical documents, but designed instead to turn our classrooms into mind-numbing indoctrination laboratories to shield our young from knowledge about the world and the hostile ideas that continue to flourish there. Shame on us if we allow this law to pass. I will say, pause here for a moment and say that I did check on the 11 sponsors, members of the legislature who co-sponsored this legislation, and I checked their party affiliation, and all 11 of them are Republicans. And I wanted to make sure of that before I said that in the article. Again, to elaborate a little bit on the paragraph I just shared with you, on first reading, a casual, superficial reading of this legislation and its purpose would lead one to conclude that finally the legislature is taking seriously the abysmal lack of understanding and knowledge that exists not only in this state but around the nation toward our history, toward the Constitution, and toward the founders. And by emphasizing the historical documents associated with the founding, one naturally, on a superficial reading of the legislation, proposed legislation, House Bill 2107, can draw the conclusion easily that this is finally the legislature waking up and determined to do something about the woeful lack of understanding and appreciation of the nation's history by our young people. But as I mentioned in that paragraph, when you read the legislation more carefully, you begin to realize that the intent behind this legislation is something quite different. Namely, well, the way I phrased it, that it is designed instead to turn our classrooms into mind-numbing indoctrination laboratories to shield our young from knowledge about the world and hostile ideas that continue to flourish there. As a repeat, and I think we mentioned this last week, the legislation requires that before students, secondary students, K through 12, high school students, before they are allowed to take classes in economics, in knowledge that deal with issues surrounding the world, that deal with socialism or communism, that deal with foreign policy, that mention the United Nations. All of these are specifically mentioned in the legislation. Before students are allowed, if this legislation passes, before students are allowed to take classes which involve any of those things, they must have completed at least a year and a half of coursework in American history, civic education, America's founding documents, etc. And again, one would think if they're reading the documents, then they're going to come away with a real appreciation for the founders. But the fact of the matter is, as we know, most of the instruction is going to be oriented not towards the students engaging the documents, but rather students being told what the documents say. In other words, what we're talking about here is indoctrination. And that's why I use the word indoctrination laboratories. Let me go back to the piece. At a time when so many agree that so much of business as usual in our classrooms must change in order to make America competitive again and prepare our young for the challenges of the 21st century, these self-proclaimed heralds of a new day in West Virginia, and of course, I guess you'd probably have to live here to experience this, but since the elections last November and the takeover of the West Virginia legislature by the Republican Party, in other words, West Virginia became a red state this past November, most of the conversation and most of the discussion have been focusing on now that the power over the state wielded for so many years by the Democratic Party in West Virginia has now been broken. And now the Republican Party is in a position to really do something about jobs, about economic development, about quality of education, about all of these things that these people believe they've been heretofore powerless to do anything about. So in reality, much of the conversation, much of the attention coming out of the West Virginia legislature in its first couple of weeks of this legislative session have emphasized the fact that we are witnessing what they are calling a new day in West Virginia. Things are really going to change. And so I refer to these people as self-proclaimed heralds of a new day in West Virginia. But what I said is, these self-proclaimed heralds of a new day in West Virginia would take us back to a time when meaningful learning was reserved exclusively for the few. For them, seemingly little has changed since 1750, when the Massachusetts General Court set out to prevent, quote, the many and great mischiefs which arise from public stage plays that tend to increase immorality, impiety, and a contempt of religion, unquote, by forbidding all theatrical entertainments. And I believe I made mention of this last week in our time together here at the Virtual Center last Wednesday, that in 1750, the Massachusetts General Court passed legislation prohibiting stage plays or other forms of theatrical entertainments because the feeling was that they tended to increase immorality, impiety, and create contempt for religion. In a sense, then, what we see in 1750 by the Massachusetts General Court is an effort by government to inject itself into the education of young people in order to shield them from the realities of a world that they cannot control. And here we are in the 21st century, in the midst of a communication revolution, which means that most of our young people have smartphones and computer access to the internet and are able to basically get information from around the world. And somehow our legislature believes that it's going to be able to pass legislation which keeps our young people totally ignorant about the world excuse me, until after they have been prepared properly for such information. Clearly, this does not smack of educational improvement. This smacks of indoctrination. And that's really the point of this piece. And I see very, very little difference between the intent of this legislation and the intent of the Massachusetts General Court in 1750 to protect its young people from immorality, contempt for religion, and impiety. I see no difference. Benjamin Rush, and you remember him here at the Virtual Center, Benjamin Rush, architect of a formula for the schools in his Of the Mode of Education Proper in a Republic, written, in 1786. Benjamin Rush created a formula for the schools to produce what he termed little Republican machines. So in 1786, Benjamin Rush advocated as the kind of an education that the masses needed to receive in order for a republic to be successful. What he saw the schools doing is producing little Republican machines. In other words, instruction aimed at telling youngsters what they should believe. If Benjamin Rush intends for the schools to produce little Republican machines, then it's pretty obvious that there wasn't going to be a whole lot of thinking and engagement in the history classrooms of the Republic. In 1786, of course, Benjamin Rush was specifically talking about Pennsylvania because the Constitution of the United States wasn't drawn up until the Constitution Convention the next year. So Benjamin Rush, who was the architect of this formula to create little Republican machines, by 1810 had come to the conclusion that there had been in America too much blurring since independence of the distinction between gentlemen and plain people, those James Fenimore Cooper termed gentile vulgar, genteel vulgar. So again, Rush is one of those people who believes, by the time you get to 1810, this is one of the letters that Rush wrote, that the distinctions between the best people and everybody else were becoming blurred as a result of independence. People really, in America, people really did begin to believe that we were to have equality or something approaching it, and that the distinctions that separated the few from the many were to disappear. That's what they saw as the ideals of the Republic. Benjamin Rush, on the other hand, believed that there was too much of this and that you couldn't afford to do it. What Rush termed a learned education ought once again to become a luxury in our country, he wrote. He still believed that the 3 R's should remain, quote, as common and as cheap as air, unquote. But should a quality education become universal, quote, that would be as destructive as universal barbarism, unquote. Rush believed, in essence, in this 1810 letter, that it was vital that we maintain the distinctions between the few and the many, between the well-educated and everybody else. Rush is the same person who wrote on the mode of education proper in a republic in 1786, 20 years earlier. What becomes clear then, and I didn't get into this kind of detail in this piece, but what becomes clear then is that Rush is one of those who really believes that you have to have 2 different kinds of education. One for the few and another kind for the many. For the many, he wants production of little Republican machines from the schools. For the few, those that would be exposed to what he called a learned education, this, he said, needed to remain a luxury. Only the few ought to have access to high-quality education. I would suggest to you that this legislation proposed in West Virginia smacks of the same kind of elitist mentality that caused Benjamin Rush in 1810 to defend the exclusive right of the few to a learned education. He's not opposed to education. Obviously, he believes education is critical to the success of the Republic. But the kind of education that the masses ought to get is one based on indoctrination, rote memorization, not thinking, not problem solving, not analysis, not critical thinking, not engagement with primary sources. It seems to me that the similarities between Rush's thinking and the legislation being proposed in our state here in West Virginia, the similarities are too close not to be connected. Rush even goes so far as to say that if you tried to give the masses quality education, real education, a learned education, as he called it, that would be as destructive as universal barbarism. You might as well just throw up your hands and forget it. Obviously, we believe in the 21st century that in order for America to really be competitive, we've got to begin to educate all of our children, not just a few, all of them. It's very obvious that there's quite a bit of resistance to that still. And it's obvious there are many people in this country who are committed to the past when it comes to the idea, and I'm struck with this myself because I actually experienced this. I was teaching with a teacher, I think I mentioned the story before. I was teaching middle school in Boston with a colleague, with a teacher. And we were talking about the fact that our students were being dismissed so that they could attend a concert by the Boston Pops, by Arthur Fiedler and the Boston Pops. This was in the late 1960s. And he made the comment about our kids, our junior high kids, that to bring these kids to Boston Symphony Hall to hear the Boston Pops Orchestra was like feeding caviar to pigs. I will never forget that as long as I live. It happened 50 years ago, and I will never forget it. To try to bring good music to these people, these kids, is like feeding caviar to pigs. I would suggest to you that in a crude way, that's the same thing that Benjamin Rush was saying. To bring a learned education to the masses would be as destructive as universal barbarism. Let me go on. America's determination to preserve social order by insisting that the masses be taught not how to think, but what to think, drove Congress in 1816 to enact a tax on imported foreign books. And you'll remember that we have made reference to this particular piece of legislation in 1816 a number of times. Congress chose to impose a tax on foreign books. And the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee defended that tariff, explained why we need it in the following way. Historian Gordon Wood reports that the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee defended the tariff by assuming a responsibility, quote, to adapt our books of instruction to the nature of the government and the genius of the people. Translation: it was important to tailor the quality of education to the caliber of students you're teaching. Don't make the bar high and try to get them to jump up to it. Rather, lower the bar so that students can experience what they believe will be success. But we know that what they see as success is really quality of the second class, or even worse. The Senate Finance Committee chairman then defended the tariff by assuming a responsibility, quote, to adapt our books of instruction to the nature of the government and the genius of the people. In foreign books, he reported, and this is all a quote, we are liable to meet with criticism and comparisons not very flattering to the American people. In American editions of these, the offensive and illiberal parts are expunged or explained, and the work is adapted to the exigencies and the tastes of the American reader. But withdraw this protection, our channels of instruction will be foreign. Our youth will imbibe sentiment, form attachments, and acquire habits adverse to our prosperity, unfriendly to our government, and dangerous to our liberties. Translation, dumb down the content. In order to meet the exigencies, in order to tailor instruction to the nature of those being taught. The genius of the people. Again, what we see here is the United States Senate promoting legislation which is designed to permit government to shield American children from ideas that are alien or unfriendly. Don't educate them so that they can handle these ideas and they can recognize bias and prejudice. Rather, shield them from it. What is the difference between the 1816 legislation to tax foreign books and the 2015 proposed legislation in West Virginia to require a year-and-a-half study on American history and government before you allow kids to take a course which touches on the world, on economics, on foreign policy, on the United Nations, on alien ideas like socialism and communism? In other words, before they encounter these things, you've got to prepare their minds so that they aren't adversely influenced by these ideas. I would suggest to you that is not education. That is the exact opposite of education. It's going to doom this nation in terms of its need to be competitive. I firmly believe this. How little difference the sentiments here from House Bill 2107, which requires that our secondary schools prep students with a minimum of 1.5 years, quote from the legislation, in the history of the United States, in civics, in the study of the United States founding documents, for the purpose of teaching, fostering, and perpetuating the ideals, principles, and spirit of political and economic democracy in America, unquote. This is directly out of the proposed legislation, House Bill 2107. Again, what is the purpose of giving students 1.5 years of study in United States history, civic education, the study of America's founding documents? What is the goal? For the purpose, the goal is, quote, for the purpose of teaching, fostering, and perpetuating the ideals and spirit of political and economic democracy in America. If you are fostering, if you are perpetuating, then you are indoctrinating. Because you are not allowing students to engage the materials in order to understand them. What you are doing is interpreting those materials and demanding that students memorize that interpretation. That is not education. That is indeed contrary to quality education. Again, House Bill 2107 mandates then that students will have at least a minimum of 1.5 years in the study of American history, civic education, and founding documents for the purpose of fostering and perpetuating the ideals, principles, and spirit of political and economic democracy in America before they can enroll in classes, quote, involving the study of social problems, global economics, foreign affairs, the United Nations, world government, socialism, or communism, unquote. Anything deemed potentially adverse to our prosperity, unfriendly to our government, and dangerous to our liberties. And of course, that last line, adverse to our prosperity, unfriendly to our government, and dangerous to our liberties, is taken directly from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chair's defense of the 1816 tax on foreign books. There is absolutely no difference. What we are doing is exactly the way that education has been tailored and structured for the masses since the beginning, since the 18th century with the Massachusetts General Court. In the late 18th century, Benjamin Rush's Mode of Education, Proper in a Republic. Congress's efforts in 1816 to impose a tax, a protective tariff on foreign books in order to keep these ideas out of the country. And here we are in the 21st century trying to do the same thing to our children here in West Virginia. It is not only counterproductive, it is a disgrace. Let me return to the text. Efforts to rationalize this effort to demean the abilities of West Virginia youngsters by linking the legislation to respect for the founders are both deceptive and dishonest. What I'm pointing to here is the very deceptive, duplicitous effort to try to rationalize this legislation by linking it to the founders and to America's founding documents, when in reality the intent is much different. The intent is much more insidious, and it has got to be celebrated and advertised. People have to know. I can share with you, I have heard comments to the effect that this particular piece of legislation will never pass. It probably won't even get out of committee. I'm unwilling to risk that. The mere fact that these 11 Republican members of the West Virginia legislature even proposed this thing needs to be trumpeted, advertised, promoted. People need to know what kinds of thinking are driving their elected representatives. So again, trying to justify or rationalize this legislation by mentioning the founders and America's founding documents is, I have said, both deceptive and dishonest. Thomas Jefferson, who led opposition to the 1816 tax on foreign books, Thomas Jefferson spoke out publicly against that tax as being as abhorrent to the ideals of education in a republic. Jefferson termed efforts to censor books and ideas that are uncomfortable, and this is a quote from a letter from Thomas Jefferson written in 1814. Any effort to censor books or ideas, Jefferson said, is, quote, an insult to our citizens, to question whether they are rational beings or not, and blasphemy against religion, to suppose it cannot stand the test of truth and reason. If a book be false in its facts, disprove them. If false in its reasoning, refute it. But for God's sake, let us freely hear both sides if we choose. Unquote. So says Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson's thinking here, as he expresses it in this letter, is if ideas are worthy, if religion is worthy, then they will be able to withstand the scrutiny of criticism and opposition, opposing ideas. But to try to defend ideas or religion as legitimate by censoring, banning all other points of view except those is not education, it is indoctrination. And I think Thomas Jefferson, in this letter, pretty much refutes efforts to link the founders to this kind of thinking. Jefferson wrote this letter in 1814. Jefferson opposed the tax on foreign books in 1816, as did Emerson and many other people. Yale University, Harvard University, they all came down against this particular piece of legislation. Let me go on as we move toward the conclusion of this piece. In the case of West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett in 1943, Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson tells us in his decision that the one fixed star in our constitutional constellation here in America is, quote, that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion. What Jackson is saying in this case, which I think is so perfect because it's a West Virginia case, is that no public official, high or petty, has the right to prescribe truth, to tell people what is orthodox, what they must believe in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion. That's what the First Amendment is about. That's what free speech is about. That's Jackson's whole point, Justice Jackson. Government does not have the right to define truth. This legislation being proposed in West Virginia suggests an effort by Republican sponsors to do just that, to define truth and to impose it upon young people for a year and a half, at least, before we believe they are properly, quote, educated, unquote, to deal with the world. Talk about head in the sand. Talk about behavior that is ostrich-like. Talk about counterproductive behavior that is not going to prepare our children here in West Virginia to be competitive nationally, nor is it going to allow America's young people to be competitive globally. This is the thinking that has dominated American education since the beginning. It's got to change. It's got to change. I find it very, very interesting that West Virginia is one of the many states that signed on in support of the Common Core standards. But I have suspected, with the new Republican majority in the state legislature, that there would be some effort to back off that endorsement of the Common Core standards in West Virginia, as has happened from conservatives in so many other states. And lo and behold, this weekend, evidence surfaced that there are efforts, official efforts within the state legislature to qualify the state's endorsement of the Common Core standards. And I don't want to, at this point, I don't want to get into the Common Core standards today, except to point out that the reason I have supported them is because they offer the promise. They do not guarantee. They do not address the issue of preparing students to be able to teach the standards, the Common Core standards. But if carried to their full potential, the standards, for the first time in our history, would refute this kind of counterproductive thinking. The idea that for the masses of people, quality education, what Benjamin Rush called a learned education, cannot be risked. We cannot risk exposing the masses to quality education. We must continue to reserve it for the few. I would suggest to you, this is the thinking that has driven American education throughout much of its history, and this is the thinking as the world is becoming much more competitive and much more connected. This is the thinking that is driving this country out of its leadership role and finds us way back in the pack, so to speak, in reading levels, math levels, appreciation of science, and all the rest of it. We are in this country on the cusp of a revolution in so many ways. At risk is literally the vision and the ideals of this republic. If we are to be really an exceptional nation, we must go forward. If we do not become involved, and we will let this kind of archaic 18th and 17th century thinking define what happens in our classrooms, we will cease to be competitive and we will lose the republic. I believe that firmly. Let me share then the final paragraph of this piece. Thinking like this. Wait a minute, I skipped the line and I apologize. Let me go back. I had mentioned the quote from Justice Jackson in West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett. Judge Lowell Reed Jr. in Reno, Janet Reno versus the American Civil Liberties Union, a case decided by the Supreme Court in 1997, Judge Lowell Reed tells us, quote, "Perhaps we do the minors of this country harm if First Amendment protections are chipped away in the name of their protection." we are doing what Judge Reed said. We are doing a disservice to our young people if we deny them First Amendment rights in order to protect them from information and ideas which they would not be comfortable with. It is wrestling with these ideas and understanding them, the pros and the cons, that constitutes the essence of what Benjamin Rush called a learned education. We can no longer reserve it exclusively for the few. We have got to begin to make it available to the many. And then the last paragraph of this particular piece says the following. Thinking like this among West Virginia's elected leaders is a disservice to the state and its people. And threatening our teachers with removal from the classroom and ineligibility for reappointment, quote, to that or a similar position for the period of 1 year, unquote. That's Section C of House Bill 2107, smacks of blackballing and the paranoia of the 1950s. This legislation proposes in Section C that teachers who resist or refuse to do this will not only be removed from the classroom, but will be prevented from finding employment in other classrooms for at least a year. That, I would suggest to you, is blackballing. In the face of promises to grow and diversify the state's economy and permit our best and our brightest to find challenge and opportunity in this, their home, it is imperative that we derail those who would keep us from moving forward. How many young professionals looking for a place to settle and raise their children will come to West Virginia in the face of archaic, un-American thinking like this? And that's the end of the piece that I put together. I'm hoping that it will find a place in some of the newspapers around the state. I'm looking forward to that. I really believe it's obvious that spending the first hour of today's program on this, that I believe this issue is critical. I think it goes a long way toward focusing on the issue of educational quality in America. It seems to me that what we are seeing is the product of efforts to educate the masses with a level of education that is tailored to the class of the particular people being educated. Those who are going to the best private schools and colleges and universities in the country are not being educated like this. In fact, if you look at the dropout rates in our colleges and universities of people who start college and don't even complete their freshman year, what you find is evidence of the fact that so many from our middle and lower classes with all sorts of ability are entering college and finding that they can't do it. They aren't prepared. They haven't been given the skills that they need to handle top quality education. Why? This legislation being proposed here in West Virginia is a reason. We have reached the end of our first hour. It's 2 p.m. in the East. We have one more hour to go. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break here, as we often do. And then we'll be back for our second hour here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I just have to say that the idea of civic responsibility suggests an approach to education which I think we've pretty much addressed for the first hour of our program today. I hope that you will agree. Please stay with us. We're going to pause for a 5-minute break, and we'll be right back. Thank you.
Now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here again is Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Thank you for that wonderful selection. I appreciate the fact that you let it go to completion.
Well, a little lovely piano music for a snowy day, right?
Oh my God, it was wonderful. Thank you. I hope folks listening enjoyed it as much as I did. It was wonderful. Thank you. Welcome to the second hour of today's program on the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is Monday. It is the second day of February in the year 2015. It is the day following the Super Bowl. It is snowing, and we've just had 5-minute piece of music that was incredible. So I want to thank Bob Kincaid for that. If you are just joining us, thank you for tuning in. And if you've been with us through our first hour, then you experienced, it seems to me, my efforts to try to put into perspective a piece of proposed legislation on education that has made it into committee here in our West Virginia legislature. It seems to me so closely linked to the Virtual Center's commitment to the idea of civic education and public service that the link can't even, it seems to me, be questioned. I think it is all part and parcel of the same issues, and I want to first I want to thank you for, if you've been with us and you are still with us, I want to thank you for staying with us. I want to invite you to participate actively in the program by using our number to our phone number to get on the air and share your ideas and your thinking with other people listening to the Virtual Center. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-HORN, HORN. If you'd like to share your ideas with me one-on-one via email, I invite you to do that. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, BRIEN, 906@gmail.com. In our first hour, and again, going back to last Wednesday, we were talking about a proposed piece of legislation that says an awful lot about education and the thinking, the kind of official thinking that goes into some of our so-called educational reform efforts. I think if I were to make one conclusion from everything that we've done in our first hour, I would say that while the focus of attention here is on education, the real issue is on the kind of thinking that defines our education, defines what our youngsters are allowed to learn and what they are denied from the opportunity to learn. I think in many ways, especially if you consider that we are in the 21st century, it is a little bit frightening. And again, the extent to which legislation like this is undoubtedly happening in other states as well, I don't think we can discount for 1 second. As I mentioned, one of the callers to Bob Kincaid's program on last Thursday night made the point that given the kind of linkages and the kind of out-of-state money that's making its way around the country in order to buy influence in our local and state elections, there's no doubt that one could look at this as a prospective trial balloon. And I really believe that is indeed a possibility. in that venue, or from that perspective, let me share. This is just an idea. This relates specifically to West Virginia, but this was a letter to the editor which appeared in our West Virginia Gazette, our state newspaper, on Saturday, January 31st, day before yesterday. It's entitled "Government by the Rich for the Rich." And it opens by making reference to the Koch brothers' revelation a week ago that they and a circle of their fellow millionaires have agreed to spend $889 million to support Republican candidates in the next election. The committee that is supporting the candidacy of Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination called this announcement from the Koch brothers a hostile takeover of America's government. Many people refer to it as literally the corruption of American democracy. And all of it stems, and of course we did quite a bit with these some months ago, all of it stems from the action of the Supreme Court, specifically in two cases. In 1976, in the case of Buckley versus Valeo, and you'll recall that we did go into this case some time ago here at the Virtual Center. In the 1976 case of Buckley versus Valeo, the justices ruled 5-4 that campaign spending is free speech and therefore cannot be limited because that would violate the First Amendment to the Constitution. And as we know, in 2010, the court reached its decision in Citizens United, and this allowed the wealthy, corporations and unions as well, to spend unlimited funds, not in direct gifts to the candidates, but through outside committees that would support particular candidates or attack others. In other words, I guess what I'm saying is the $889 million pledge from the Koch brothers seems to be kind of the logical conclusion of the Citizens United decision and the Buckley versus Valeo decisions, which basically made our political campaign system vulnerable to big money. A reporter for the Charleston Gazette named David Gutman revealed just last week that here in West Virginia, Republicans, wealthy Republicans, are pouring money into the West Virginia elections. In other words, the takeover of the West Virginia legislature this past November by Republicans after so many years of Democratic domination of the legislature in West Virginia was not an accident. Gutman's research suggests that, in fact, control of the legislature was pretty much bought. Not only with out-of-state money, but also big money within the state. And Gutman's research points out how they did it, and I wanted to share this with you. There was created ostensibly a non-political organization called Go West Virginia. Theoretically, it's a social welfare organization called Go West Virginia. The money that has been raised in West Virginia is being put into this organization and then transferred into a Republican group called Grow West Virginia. with the very same mailing address as Go West Virginia. By law, the political group must reveal its donors. But since the donor is Go West Virginia, that means that those who have contributed money to this effort remain anonymous. In other words, by creating a non-political social organization called Go West Virginia, money is poured into that group. Then in turn, that group turns the money over to the GOP in a political organization called Grow West Virginia. Grow West Virginia requires that donors be identified. But since in this case the donor is the social organization called Go West Virginia, there are no names associated with it. Gutman's research revealed that 78 West Virginians donated more than $500,000 to Go West Virginia just a week ago at a country club outside Charleston. I think what we're seeing then is the economic side of political life in this one small state. I think it's very interesting that this big money is going into Republican candidates, and it was Republican sponsors who proposed House Bill 2107 that we addressed in the first hour of today's program here at the Virtual Center. I think we are seeing something here that we would be remiss not to focus on and shine the light of day on. This must be publicized. People in West Virginia and outside West Virginia have to know, because it's not only the specific piece of legislation that is at issue here, it's the mentality. It's the attitude and the philosophy which drives it, which is not exclusive to West Virginia, but is increasingly becoming, unfortunately, not exclusive to the Republican Party. I don't in any way want to send a message that we have good guys and bad guys here in West Virginia. The bad guys are the Republican, the good guys are the Democrats. I think one of the most revealing comments was made just after, the day after, the November elections here in West Virginia, when one of the local senators, state senators, from an adjoining county to this one, switched his party affiliation from Democrat to Republican, which gave the Republicans a one-seat majority in the Senate. That senator, whose name is Daniel Hall, when asked by the press whether in fact he was comfortable switching parties when the voters of his district had elected him as a Democrat, his response was, in West Virginia, there's very little difference between Democrats and Republicans. Both parties are united in their opposition to big government in Washington, specifically to the Obama administration. At the time, that rationalization seemed pretty weak. But the reality is, there really isn't that much difference in West Virginia. And I think opposition to the progressive nature of the National Democratic Party is an indication as to why people like Daniel Hall find it so easy to move from one party to the other without any kind of philosophical shift in thinking. I think this particular article about the legislation and how you can do it and what we can anticipate in the election, in our next election in 2016, I think is very, very, very significant. I've got a number of issues, a number of things, and I'm not taking these in any order. But as many of you know, we spent quite a bit of time maybe a couple of months ago looking at Gary Wills's book. First, his book on the Declaration of Independence called Inventing America, and secondly, his book on the Federalist Papers entitled Explaining America. And as I mentioned, we'll be back to this book, and we will. We'll be back to it again. It's very, very rich in what it contains. Chapter after chapter, it seems to me, provides something well worth reading. But what I wanted to direct to your attention is the introduction to Gary Wills's book, Explaining America. A couple of our listeners have told me that they have purchased this book. And I guess maybe I'm talking specifically to them at this point. But if you look at that book, specifically at the introduction to it, the last couple of pages of the introduction are an outline of the Federalist Papers. And I think it's a very valuable outline because it really tells us what the various Federalist Papers, and remember there are 85 of them, are about. An outline like this gives us an opportunity to go to the particular Federalist Papers that raise the issues that we want to raise, whether it's Congress, whether it's the House, whether it's the Senate, whether it's the courts, whether it's criticism of the Articles of Confederation, whatever it happens to be. There are 85 papers. And I think it's very, very helpful for those who really want to get into the Federalist Papers in some depth to have access to this outline of the arguments made by Publius. I thought that I would take a moment. I don't know how long this will take and I don't want to push the issue, but I just wanted to share with you how valuable this particular item, this particular outline is. Let me give you an example. The outline is divided into two parts. Part 1 addresses the Articles of Confederation and why the authors of the Federalist Papers believe that they are inadequate to the needs of the nation, to the Union. Basically, the first 36 Federalist Papers of the 85 focus primarily on criticism of various aspects of the Articles of Confederation. For example, let me just give you a couple of examples of what you can expect if you do avail yourself of access to this particular outline. Federalist number 1, the outline says the following: plea for candor, prospectus of the series, Hamilton. So what it means is the very first Federalist Papers is an argument for candor and a general looking ahead at what the Federalist Papers plan to address and why. Federalist Paper number 2, the Article's failure prompted the Philadelphia Convention. This is written by John Jay. In other words, the extent to which weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation precipitated the call for the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. That's the second Federalist Paper. Numbers 3, 4, 5, and 6 are Jay's arguments as to why the Articles of Confederation are inadequate for defense purposes, military purposes. Jay's strength in 3, 4, 5, and 6 are in the defense, the weaknesses, if you will, of America in a hostile world militarily. Number 7 and 8 are written by Hamilton, and the message here is the same argument continued. In other words, Hamilton picks up the idea of the need to strengthen the central government in order to improve the defensive capabilities of the United States within a hostile world. Federalist number 9, which we spent a lot of time on here, is Hamilton's argument about the fact that a Confederate republic is adequate to the Union's needs. This is the one where Hamilton makes the argument about domestic insurrections and the fact that we need a government that can protect the nation from these. Then, of course, is the very famous number 10, written by Madison, about the nature of an extended republic, the enlarged sphere, so to speak. Federalist 11, 12, and 13, the next three papers, address the inadequacy of the Articles of Confederation in trade and taxes and overall management of the nation's affairs. Those three papers are written by Hamilton. Federalist number 14, written by Madison, is a return to number 10, in which Madison goes on to speak in addition an extended period on the nature of the enlarged sphere, or a national republic, as opposed to a republic that is restricted to each individual sovereign state. Federalists 15, 16, and 17 point out how the Articles of Confederation are weak because government is unable to act because of multiple sovereigns. In other words, the sovereignty of each individual state, as opposed to the power of Congress. 18, 19, and 20 are written by Madison. And in them, Madison goes back through history and points out how unsuccessful confederations have been in the past. Goes all the way back to the ancients, and Madison looks at all of the history of republics in the nation, why they failed, how they were structured, why they failed, why they didn't work. Federalist number 21 is written by Hamilton. And basically, he's talking specifically about the fact that the Articles of Confederation government lacks the necessary power to tax. The biggest weakness of the Confederation government is its inability to tax, which means its inability to generate an income, and thereby its dependence on the states. Federalist number 22 through 29 focus primarily on military needs for the nation. These are written by Hamilton. And 30 to 36 deal with other powers necessary to the central government, also written by Hamilton, primarily focusing on the need for the power to tax. Those are the first 36 Federalist Papers. All of them are criticisms of the Articles of Confederation from different perspectives and different venues. Beginning with number 37, the Federalist Papers addressed the new Constitution as a Republican solution to the needs of the nation identified in the first 36 papers. In other words, for 36 papers, the Federalist Papers talked about the weaknesses under the Articles. Starting with 37 and going all the way up to the end to number 85, the Federalist Papers address various aspects of the Constitution as a Republican solution to those weaknesses. 37 and 38, the first two in this second section, Federalist numbers 37 and 38 are written by Madison. And in these two papers, Madison deals with the issue of compromise and points out how much compromise there was at the Constitutional Convention in order to get the Constitution that is up for ratification. Number 39, which we have read here at the Virtual Center, is an important one. It's also written by Madison. That's the paper in which Madison deals with the issue of republicanism. Madison makes the point that even though the Constitution creates a national or a united union, it still maintains its republican nature. Number 40 is Madison, and Madison points out in number 40 the competence, the skills of the people who put the Constitution together. And of course, we know that mainly it was Madison himself in the Virginia Plan who basically put together the outlines of what becomes the Constitution of the United States. So in these papers, 37, 38, 39, and 40, Madison addresses the issue of the spirit of the Constitution. The fact that it's Republican, the fact that it's the product of compromise, the fact that it was framed or created by shrewd, wise people. The second issue under the Constitution covers the Federalist Papers from 41 all the way up to 66. And these papers address the specific powers of the new government under the Constitution. 41, for example, military powers. 42, diplomatic powers and interstate powers. That one's written by Madison. 43, miscellaneous powers of the new federal government, written by Madison. 44 and 66 deals with federalism, the division of power between the central government under the Constitution and the state governments. Then we get to the issue of separation of powers, the division of government into legislative, executive, and judicial. 47 and 48 talk about separation of powers, but point out that it is not absolute. Madison writes that one. 49 and 50 deal further with the issue of separation. 51, Federalist 51, which is a major one written by Madison, deals with the issue of bicameralism, the internal checks provided by a legislative branch divided into a lower house and an upper house, the Senate of the United States. Then there are a number of papers that address the issue of the House of Representatives, Congress. 52, 53, 54, all the way up through 61, deal with the structure and the operation of the House of Representatives, how they're elected, the length of the terms of the delegates, how representatives are apportioned. In other words, how the decision is made as to how many delegates, how many congressmen each state gets. 55 and 56 deal with the appropriate number of representatives linked to the proportional population. Madison makes the point, for example, that if you have too many representatives, you can't have effective and efficient government. You have chaos. On the other hand, Madison says, if you have too few representatives, you make Congress susceptible to cliques and interest groups, factions. So what Madison argues is there need to be an optimum balance in the proportion of representatives in light of the people to be represented. Number 57, Madison writes this one, deals with the qualifications of members of Congress. What qualifications they need them. This is the people's branch. This is considered to be, in a republic, the key branch of government. Therefore, in the Constitution, it's the longest section, and in the Federalist Papers, it receives attention from the most papers. Then in number 58, Madison talks about changing the ratio of representatives to citizens. You know, as population continues to grow, how do we manage efficiently and effectively the size of representation as it occurs in Congress? And then in 59, 60, and 61, Hamilton deals with the House's control, the House of Representatives' ability to control its own elections, choose its own members. Then the Federalist Papers move into consideration of the United States Senate. 62, 63, 64, 65, and 66 deal with the United States Senate. Its composition, the length of the senators' terms, and why they are that much longer than the House. We know that representatives in Congress are elected for 2-year terms. But we also know that members of the Senate only have to run for re-election every 7 years. And Madison explains in number 63 why that extended period for the election of senators exists. In 64, we get a return from John Jay. Remember, John Jay wrote Federalist Papers 2 through 6. I believe it was 2 through 6. Maybe it was 2 through 7. 2 through 6. And then he hasn't been heard of again. Everything but it's after number 6, up until now, was written by either Hamilton or Madison. Now in number 64, Jay returns and talks about Congress's treaty-making powers, the role of the Senate, in affirming treaties. You'll notice that John Jay's contribution to the Federalist Papers seems to be exclusively in the issue of foreign affairs. He deals with the foreign affairs issues, the issues of defense and relations with other nations. Madison and Hamilton deal with everything else. Federalist number 65 and number 66 are written by Hamilton, and they deal with the impeachment power. How impeachments run. The House impeaches, the Senate hears the case and makes the decision. Not only for president, but for the Supreme Court as well. Then beginning in 67, we get to the executive department, the president. 67, 8, and 9, all of these are written by Hamilton. All the way from 67 to 77, 11 papers are devoted to the presidency and the power of the president. They deal with such things as why the president is not monarchical but Republican, the length of terms of the presidential term of office, what the limits on the president's power are, and then 74 through 77 deal with the specific powers of the president. pardon, treaty, and appointments. Beginning with 78, we look at the judiciary, and you'll know that over the last couple of months, we've been spending most of our time in the Federalist Papers looking at 78, 79, 80, 81, and 82, dealing with the Supreme Court, with the courts, the court system. 78, as you'll remember, we addressed the issue of the power of the courts and the fact that the right of judicial review does not constitute judicial supremacy. Rather, in a republic, it's critical that the legislative branch of government remain primary. Hamilton addresses that issue in number 78. Then in 79, we deal with the lifetime tenure of justices. Number 80, the limits of office. 81, the powers of the court, of the judges. 82, the relations between federal courts and state courts. And then in number 83, Hamilton addresses the issue of the fact that the Constitution of the United States does not in any way interfere with citizens' right to a jury trial. In number 84, which is actually the Federalist paper that I planned on covering next here at the Virtual Center, obviously not today, but maybe beginning tomorrow, 84 deals with the fact that the Constitution does not contain a Bill of Rights. 84 is Hamilton's defense of the lack of a Bill of Rights in the Constitution as it was drafted by the Philadelphia Convention. And then, of course, 85, which we spent an incredible amount of time on here at the Virtual Center, is the conclusion, Hamilton's explanation as to what the Federalist Papers have accomplished and how well. Again, if you have access to Gary Wills's book, Explaining America, in its introduction, you will find that outline of the Federalist Papers. It is well worth the time. Perhaps if you go to a library and just check out Explaining America, you can copy that outline and have it available so that you can use it as a specific reference to specific Federalist Papers by number. Rather than and again, one of the things I found, and it took me a long time to realize this, is the Federalist Papers, reading the Federalist Papers is like the conflict between the forest and the trees. Once you get into the details of the specific papers, you kind of lose the perspective of the overall organization of the whole project. And it's that organization of the project, of the entire project, looked at in one piece, if you will, that seems to me very, very worthwhile. And again, I've taken about 20, 25 minutes of your time here today to make you aware of this outline, but I really think it's valuable, and the more I return to it, the more valuable I find it. My decision about 3 months ago to spend some time on the judiciary was principally because the court system is rarely addressed, and when talking about the Federalist Papers. And if it is addressed, it's only number 78, because most textbooks tell us that 78 is the justification for judicial review. And of course, one of the things we realized as we looked at number 78 is that it does not deal with judicial review at all. It deals with the reality of judicial review as not constituting judicial supremacy. That's Hamilton's argument, and it's a very important one. Because in 78, and especially in number 81, Hamilton makes the case that the idea or the power of judicial review is generally assumed to be there. It's not a power that the courts get from the Constitution. It's a power that the that the Constitution assumes courts ought to have. And I think that's Madison's point, not only in number 78, but in number 81 as well. I've been doing besides doing some writing over the weekend, as we learned in our first hour today, I've been doing quite a bit of reading. I love to go through the letters of Hamilton and Madison and the rest of them, and on Rotunda on the internet. And one of the things I came across, which I just wanted to share with you, if I could, is a letter written in 1804 from James Madison to Noah Webster. And, of course, many of you, of course, will recognize Noah Webster as being the author, obviously, of the dictionary. It's a letter written on October 12th, 1804. And in it, Hamilton is kind of outlining for Noah Webster the process of creating the Constitution, where it came from. And it's very interesting because in this letter, Madison speaks to the Mount Vernon Convention of March 85, in which Washington invites delegates from Maryland and Virginia to his home on the Potomac, to Mount Vernon. And it's at that conference that the delegates decide that the next year they will have a conference devoted exclusively to trade, commerce, and that one will meet at Annapolis. And so the origins of the Annapolis Convention are to be found at the Mount Vernon Conference in March of 86. And Madison goes through that and explains it to Webster. He doesn't go into a lot of details about Mount Vernon, because you'll recall that Madison was not there. Virginia was represented, but Madison wasn't. Madison did not know about the Mount Vernon Conference, primarily because Patrick Henry, the governor, didn't tell him. Patrick Henry was Madison's sworn enemy politically. And Patrick Henry did not let Madison know that the Mount Vernon Convention was even happening. So consequently, what Madison knows about the Mount Vernon Conference, he finds out after the fact. And then he talks about the Mount Vernon delegates at the Mount Vernon Conference calling the Annapolis Convention. And I wanted to read just one sentence from this letter that Madison writes to Noah Webster, because in it, Madison takes credit for calling the Annapolis Convention. He says, quote, "In 1785, I made a proposition with success in the legislature of the same state, Virginia, for the appointment of commissioners to meet at Annapolis, such commissioners as might be appointed by other states, in order to form some plan for investing Congress with the regulation and taxation of commerce." The fact of the matter is, the reason I wanted to share this with you is I find this a little bit disconcerting, because Madison was pretty much opposed to the Annapolis Convention. His concern was that his desire to strengthen the national government by revising the Articles would be derailed if the Annapolis Convention was successful. And so that's the point that I would make, is that Madison really was concerned about Annapolis for fear that if the delegates were successful in reaching some sort of interstate agreement on commerce, that the impetus for calling a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation, to revise the central government totally, would be unsuccessful. So I find it interesting that he's telling Noah Webster that he's the one that invited commissioners to Annapolis, when in fact he was one of the people that attended Annapolis, but he was not in favor of it. He was not in favor of it because he was afraid that it would be successful. And one of the things that I did this weekend after I found this letter was to find the report, the official report that Hamilton wrote on the Annapolis Convention. And I did some digging and I found the report. We've talked about it before, and we'll probably go into this a little bit in tomorrow's program because we don't have that much time today. We're approaching 5 minutes of the hour. It's 2:54 now here in the East. But what I wanted to share with you before we ended our day today, we've talked about the fact that many people believe that the Annapolis Convention failed because so few states and so few delegates showed up. And most textbooks say that. But that Hamilton kind of in the 11th hour saved the day by putting forward the report that called for what becomes the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. In the course of doing some research and finding this report of the Annapolis Convention, I found the list of delegates who attended Annapolis. There were only 12. Only 12 delegates attended the Annapolis Convention. They were from 5 states. So small was the group that they didn't meet in one of Annapolis's official state buildings. They met at Mann's Tavern in Annapolis. Obviously, they met in the tavern because the group was so small. But another factor, which I think caused them to not meet in an official state building for the state of Maryland, was that Maryland was one of the states that chose to not appoint delegates to the Annapolis Convention. Who were the delegates? From New York, there were 2, Alexander Hamilton and Egbert Benson. And I don't think anybody probably has ever heard of Egbert Benson, but everybody's heard of Alexander Hamilton. From New Jersey, Abraham Clark, William Houston, and James Sherman. From Pennsylvania, 1 delegate, Tench Coxe. Tench Coxe was one of the most influential and prominent merchants and bankers in the state of Pennsylvania. In other words, he was the only representative from Pennsylvania at the Annapolis Convention, but he was an important one. From the state of Delaware, George Read, John Dickinson, and Richard Bassett. It seems to me that the name that jumps out at us there is John Dickinson. John Dickinson was one of the most prominent members of the Continental Congress during the Revolution and of the Confederation Congress after. John Dickinson was the leader of the conservative wing within the Continental Congress. John Dickinson was one of the leaders of the position to try to find a way, an olive branch, in order to avoid independence. At the same time, John Dickinson was the author of the famous Letters of a Pennsylvania Farmer. And then from Virginia, there are 3 delegates: Edmund Randolph, James Madison, and St. George Tucker. 12. And that's all. And basically, the major conclusion or the major success of the Annapolis Convention was the call for the Philadelphia Convention the very next year. We'll go back to this a little bit in tomorrow's program, but right now we only have 1 minute left to go in our program today. So let me take this opportunity to thank you for tuning in to the. Remember that tomorrow, Tuesday, we start 1/2 hour later than we do on Mondays and Wednesdays. We'll be meeting tomorrow at 1:30 here at the Virtual Center. For the Virtual Center, for Bob Kincaid and the folks at the Head On Radio Network, this is Bill O'Brien thanking